Welcome, everyone. We are so excited that you are joining us for the annual Daffodil Lecture on Sustainability and the Environment. The annual lecture is a very special one since it is in honor of the late Dr. Priscilla Clarkson, former Dean of Commonwealth Honors College, who initiated the Daffodil Lecture during the college's 10th anniversary in 2009. Professor Brian Dulock, as he's noted, he is the coordinator actually of the Honor Seminar series. He has noted that the lectures were named after her love for this beautiful flower, the daffodil. The environmental theme of the lectures also reflect the campus's initiatives in the areas of green research and energy and sustainability, including the development of biofuels and wind energy. The Honor Seminar also engages with these issues, and this lecture is a big part of the course of the Honor Seminar. I am thrilled that Dr. Olivia Aguilar has been selected as a speaker for the 2021 Daffodil Lecture this spring. She is the Leslie and Sarah Miller Director of the Miller-Worley Center for the Environment and an Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Mount Holyoke College. Her teaching is interdisciplinary by nature, often examining both the science and human dimensions of environmental issues. Her classes are often experiential and community-based, including her most recent course on food equity and empowerment. Similarly, using her background in horticulture, natural resources, and education, her research crosses many fields and areas of study, often at the intersection of community, race, and transformative learning in environmental education. Specifically, she examines how and why environmental and science learning communities are exclusive and how they can be more inclusive of groups that are often marginalized. Her current research involves collecting oral histories from people in the Latinx community to reframe the normative discourse on what it means to be outdoors for an upcoming book. Her lecture today is titled Seeking the Justice in Environmental and Sustainability Work, How Far We've Come and Where We Go. And I am absolutely excited that she is here with us today. I hope that you are too. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Aguilar.
Gracias, Mari. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the warm welcome, and it's just really an honor to be here. So first, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which I reside is not mine. This talk is about justice, and for this reason, I want to appropriately acknowledge that I live and work on the ancestral lands of the Nonotuck, neighbored by the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, the Mohegan, the Pequot, the Mohican, and the Abenaki. Also, many thanks to Professor Castaneda for inviting me, and the Commonwealth Honors College and University of Massachusetts, Amherst, for hosting me. It's such an honor to be speaking to so many of you and your students today. And I want to note, I'm going to share my a PowerPoint here for everybody to follow along with, but because I can share PowerPoint or notes, I'm sharing my PowerPoint and I'll be sort of looking to the side with my notes. So hopefully you can follow along and have some patience there with me. It's also a really exciting day today because today Deb Haaland is being confirmed into the cabinet, and she is the first Indigenous person to be confirmed into the cabinet secretary. She will be running the Interior Department, which is important for us because we're talking about managing sustainability or sustainable resources. So that's really exciting, a lot of exciting things happening today. So I'm gonna give my talk in 3 parts. I'm gonna be talking to you about race and environmental issues and how the two are interrelated, and then we'll get into sustainability and where justice fits into all of this. And I wanna also acknowledge that this is a very US-centric talk. I talk about race and environmental issues from the perspective of an American and the perspective of a woman of color. And so I just want to make that clear at the outset because the conversation may make assumptions about American environmentalism. And so I want that to be clear. I'm also going to present this in 3 parts, as I mentioned. First, we'll examine the troubled history of environmentalism, and then we'll look at how this history has influenced environmental movements and notions of sustainability. And then part 3, we'll discuss what we can do to move justice and sustainability forward. So,
Olivia, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
that's okay.
I'm not seeing your PowerPoint, and I think you you have a PowerPoint that you want to share?
I do, and did not realize I did not share it. Thank you so much. Let me, there we go. Okay, so we're good. I just had my thank you and was talking about the part 1, part 2, and part 3. So we're on sort of naming the issue. And I think it's important that we name the issue. I hope that what we've started to learn, particularly from deepened conversations around race this past year, is that we have to name and recognize problems of discrimination, racism, and injustice in order to solve for them. For us to discuss why it's important to see justice as a necessary part of sustainability, we have to also understand where the injustice begins in this conversation. So this means first examining the troubled history of the environmental field. And I want to start with a story. I recently saw Susanna Morris give a fabulous talk, and she reminded me that it's always good to start with your story. So a little of my story is that I was a first-generation college student and went off to college without knowing much about what to do with the degree. I really didn't understand the system, but I knew I needed a major. And I've told this story in other venues, so I'm going to skip a lot. I won't bore you here. I'll skip ahead and tell you that I ended up getting degrees in science-related fields, horticulture and natural resources. And I often found myself as the only brown girl in classes that were predominantly white, and then in a field that was predominantly white, and then in a department that was predominantly white. So I came to understand there was something about me in this work that was unique. Eventually, I felt comfortable calling myself an environmental educator. And even though I was now amongst educators and not strictly scientists, I still found myself as one of the only, if not the only, brown girls in the room. It was even more pronounced in this very specific field. At the same time, when I would try to raise issues of racial justice in the field, many people would shut the conversation down. They simply did not see how the 2 issues were related. But I had a vantage point because I was experiencing it. I wasn't the only one noticing this dilemma in the environmental field. In fact, in 1990, an important letter was written by the Southwest Organizing Project, a coalition of organizations dealing with social justice issues, and distributed to the 10 largest mainstream environmental organizations, now famously referred to as the Letter to the Group of 10. In it, they asked for mutual strategizing to create a global environmental movement that protects us all. Reminding the Big 10 that for centuries, people of color in our region have been subjected to racist and genocidal practices, including the theft of lands and water, the murder of innocent people, and the degradation of our environment. And then later stating, and I don't have it shown up here, but stating that your organizations continue to support and promote policies which emphasize the cleanup and preservation of the environment on the backs of working people in general and people of color in particular. In the name of eliminating environmental hazards at any cost, across the country, industrial and other economic activities which employ us are being shut down, curtailed, or prevented while our survival needs and cultures are ignored. We suffer from the end results of these actions, but are never full participants in the decision-making which leads to them. This is pretty powerful, and you might think it would be enough to get the mainstream environmental organizations to jump into action, but as you can see from this rudimentary timeline that I've created, the litany of reports highlighting the need for mainstream environmental organizations to attend to issues of social and racial justice continued even into a couple of weeks ago. In fact, 2 weeks ago, Politico came out with a report that highlighted discriminatory practices and racial tensions at the Union of Concerned Scientists and at least 2 large environmental organizations which belong to the Big 10. Noting again that the environmental organizations must work harder to be more inclusive of both BIPOC communities and issues relevant to these communities. The question then is why the environmental arena is plagued with these racial dilemmas, and why has justice been a topic so difficult to grasp by the mainstream environmental organizations? The answer is complicated, but I want to at least highlight a few reasons here. First, as noted in the letter to the Big Ten, the field itself was built on a legacy of land theft, colonization, and exploitation of BIPOC communities. Many of us are aware of this, but as a reminder, the first national parks were only able to be designated as such once Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed and then kept from these lands. Ibarra also reminds us that were it not for the Indigenous lands seized through the US-Mexican War, not only would the space to create these national parks exist, but neither would the concept of wilderness, often associated with these vast spaces and romanticized by Anglo-Americans. In fact, some have argued that the construct of the environment itself is where people of color began to be marginalized in their relationship to it, either through a Cartesian or colonial view of the environment as separate from the body and in possession of others. In a close examination of the etymology of the term wilderness, Nash points out that it has been used to describe both a place absent of and hostile to humans, as well as a place that serves as refuge and respite for humans. With more scrutiny, Cronin points out that the American wilderness was a concept constructed by people who were influenced by place and time, specifically a place and time in which it was easy and perhaps beneficial to erase or ignore the former indigenous inhabitants of the land. In other words, colonization, war, and land theft were used by the US government to push BIPOC communities off the land, creating spaces for white people to gather and recreate. Furthermore, Wald, Vasquez, Ibarra, and Ray argue that the work of the environmentalists in the US was to preserve nature and non-human species, which was rooted in values associated with middle to upper class whites and racially coded. Taylor supports this and reminds us that because of the ethnic and racial groups we belong to, we've had different experiences in resource distribution and in civil human rights, both of which affect how we come to see and address environmental issues. Despite these differences as a society, without even being aware, we get caught up in normative paradigms. This is true even in environmental and sustainability fields. And these paradigms are often introduced to us through a particular canon or the literature deemed critical to the field. In fact, if you look at the canon associated with environmental studies, it is easy to see how the field of environmentalism has been an exclusive domain since its inception. Most of us in the field have read the works of white men and even women to understand human connections to nature. The environmentalists that are regularly celebrated in textbooks I've both read and even taught include names like John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, sometimes Wendell Berry, and maybe Wangari Maathai if textbooks are trying to be inclusive. Essentially, I was being taught and then subsequently taught to my own students that a relationship to nature came in the way that these people were connected to nature. But we model what we see. So the question is, what happens when we don't see ourselves? And here's another, I think, interesting example that we can learn from. The name John Muir is known well in environmental fields. He is often celebrated as the father of the US National Park System and co-founder of the Sierra Club. He's there on the screen. The Sierra Club, just to mention, is one of the Big Ten organizations. His writings are found in numerous places and elucidate a connection to nature that is meant to be pristine and pure. He shows us the aesthetic and spiritual side of nature, again romanticizing wilderness. Interestingly, another naturalist lived around the same time as John Muir. She was actually born 20 years earlier, but died just within a year of him. And she really wasn't recognized as a naturalist until very recently, especially with the release of the film that bore her name, Harriet. I hope I don't spoil the story, but it turns out that in order for Harriet Tubman to successfully navigate slaves through the Underground Railroad, she had to know the natural world intimately. Imagine having to find your way across hundreds of miles under the cover of night while hiding for fear of enslavement, torture, or death. It would benefit you to know how to use the stars as your guide or to know what's edible or how to follow water. A recent Audubon article tells us she imitated the call of the barred owl as a signal for those who she was helping to escape. In this way, nature is neither aesthetic nor spiritual for Harriet, but rather a necessary companion, something to depend on in order to survive at a very deep level. I don't want to be glib about why we are able to read Muir's naturalist writings and not Harriet's from that time, but it's not lost on me that Tubman was fairly busy bringing slaves to freer lands, and then after that, helping the Union Army. She also, if I have my facts correct, did not write. In 1908, the Muir Woods National Monument was created by Teddy Roosevelt to honor John Muir. The Harriet Tubman National Park was created just 7 years ago in 2013. Think about how this plays out then over history and into our lives. It is such an important example of how racial privilege sets a stage for how we come to understand and study the environment. How many other Black, Indigenous, people of color did not have the means to sit with their thoughts about the mountains or the rivers they knew like the backs of their hands, to write about it and find a way to get it published? How many other studies, experiences, and observations did not make it into our canon? To put it plainly, people of color have long been ignored, dismissed, and damaged by the environmental field. Unfortunately, the issues I've raised, the disregard of racial justice by issues by longstanding environmental organizations, land theft and genocide associated with national parks, and the influence of class and race on what we study in environmental fields rarely make it into the traditional environmental studies canon. At the same time, some literature in the fields of environmental education suggested that BIPOC communities weren't present in the academic field because they simply cared less about environmental issues. In fact, much of the scholarship along these lines could be described as what Tuck refers to as damage-centered research, wherein the scholarship precluded us from being part of the conversation about how to improve our people's connections to nature, and as a consequence, distorted our relationship with the environment. Because of this, the values associated with environmentalism perpetuated the values of the dominant culture, while simultaneously excluding the culture and values of those outside of the dominant culture, becoming something of a positive feedback loop for whiteness in the environmental field. It is no wonder then that Taylor, as Taylor notes, quote, "The history of American environmentalism presented by most authors is generally limited to the perspective of white middle-class male environmental activism," end quote. And that the field was both accommodating to and resonated with white middle-class persons. It is also no wonder then that I often found myself as the sole person of color in these spaces. It took me a while to uncover how this history contributed to what I was experiencing, but Black feminist theories helped me find the language to decipher the white privilege I was working against in my own field. Black female scholars have also been instrumental over the past 2 decades in gradually exposing the way in which environmental experiences and concerns of people of color are expressed. While Dorceta Taylor brought this issue to light in 1989 through a quantitative meta-analysis of surveys, others have taken a more autobiographical approach. For instance, Bell Hooks, feminist theorist and English scholar, evokes the issues of race and environmentalism in her book, Belonging: A Culture of Place. Though it serves as tribute to the Kentucky hills in which she grew up, Hooks' book captures the importance of the front porch, farming land, and walking as a connection for Black people to the environment. In a similar vein, Laurette Savoy, my fabulous colleague, in Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape, provides a personal perspective on the issue of how race influenced her relationship with the land. Less autobiographical, but of significant influence is Finney's Black Faces, White Spaces. In her seminal book, Finney draws on multiple fields, including areas like popular culture, African-American studies, critical race studies, geography, art, and music to examine how discriminatory environmental experiences impact the ecological identity of African Americans. These works have quickly become important pieces for those of us critically analyzing how relationships between BIPOC communities and the environment are defined and substantiated. They've helped to identify the complex histories of racism, racial silencing, land grabbing, and physical exclusion, which have led to complicated relationships with the environment for people of color. So much so that many people of color have a difficult time to this day identifying as environmentalist and finding a movement that addresses their needs. So I'm going to move to part 2 now, a complicated movement. As we've seen, this history has played a role then in the development of various movements that exist to address environmental and sustainability issues. From an exclusive modern environmental movement to a global sustainable development movement, the inclusion or exclusion of BIPOC communities' needs has framed the way in which movements have been able to progress. First, I think many would argue that as a result of the traditional canon that I described earlier, especially Carson's Silent Spring, a social movement often referred to as modern environmentalism erupted in the late 1960s. Some even claim that Carson's work served as a major impetus to the development of the Environmental Protection Agency and its first hard-hitting policies, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, which, by the way, were passed by Nixon back when environmental protection was supported by both US political parties. I just want to make a note of that. According to Nordhaus and Schellenberger, this was an era that emphasized the inextricable link between visible pollution and the health of nature and non-human species. So for instance, when you think of Silent Spring, you often see images of dead fish or dead birds. This was also an era that sought policy informed by science as the major tool to combat environmental issues. And finally, it was an era that presented an environmental message as warning, which we often refer to as doom and gloom. In this way, though, the modern environmental movement had some unforeseen consequences. Environmental problems had to be visible to be taken seriously, and this became problematic when climate change arrived on the scene and it was more difficult to visualize. And because policy change was now reliant on scientific findings, industries like the oil and gas industry essentially used tactics to make science look uncertain. And finally, because the concern for the environment at this time was largely focused on nature and our non-human species, their agenda was limited to a very narrow special interest. For these reasons, it's been difficult for major environmental organizations like the groups from the Big Ten to address issues facing BIPOC communities. Because modern environmentalists historically did not tie the consequences of climate change to the real struggles of all people, the issue is seen as special interest, only affecting a few. For instance, the doom and gloom of the polar bears, as we see here in this image, might ring a bell for us or resonate because we saw it so widespread. It was used to drum up concern around climate change. And while distressing, was a lot less relevant for people who were dealing with issues like you see on the other side of this slide, like the water crisis. This is actually a picture that's often used in articles about the Flint, Michigan water crisis. I'm not entirely sure if this is actually water in Flint, but this is a picture that's used quite a lot to depict that. The moral of the story, though, is that communities of color are feeling like their environmental concerns were going unnoticed, and they didn't fit the mainstream agenda. So the environmental justice movement filled this need. It began in the US when the predominantly Black community of Warren County, North Carolina, fought the decision to place a toxic landfill in their backyard. With the help of the United Church of Christ and their Commission for Racial Justice, a seminal report on the disproportionate location of toxic waste facilities in communities of color and predominantly lower socioeconomic groups was made public. This is important because it was the racial justice concerns of a church and its members, and not those of any environmental organization, that paved the way for this movement. Unlike the modern environmentalist, poverty, education, and living conditions became prominent issues under the charge of the environmental justice movement. Additionally, people of color, people of a lower socioeconomic status, and people often without means or power were the crusaders of this movement. So we began to see two very distinct movements in the US with two different audiences. Around the same time as the environmental justice movement, global environmentalists began to recognize that many of the environmental issues the world was dealing with, as countries were also trying to become more developed, things like loss of rainforest, desertification, and climate change, were not only linked to human health, but also to issues like poverty, education, quality of life, women's rights, and community development. In other words, some of the issues that environmental justice advocates were aiming for here domestically. A proliferation of international declarations from the mid-1980s to 1990s began to articulate how environmental problems as a result of development encompassed more than just the natural environment. This movement came to be known as sustainable development, which was originally defined by the Brundtland Report, also known as Our Common Future, as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we often see this definition when we're talking about sustainable development. Ultimately, we use this term to describe processes of economic development or growth, while using the term sustainability to refer as a way in which natural resources are managed. Here's a definition of sustainability from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And it reads, sustainability means ensuring human rights and well-being without depleting or diminishing the capacity of the Earth's ecosystems to support life, or at the expense of others' well-being. It is a multidimensional concept encompassing environmental integrity, social well-being, economic resilience, and good governance. Each of these sustainability dimensions involves several issues, and all dimensions need to be considered. Sustainability is an ambitious objective that can be reached through different pathways. And I use this because I like the image of the pathways being interconnected. And I also like the fact that where we typically see three branches under sustainability, which include environment, economics, and then social branches, here they've sort of distinguished the social branches into people and governance. Still, as we work towards sustainable development goals, most people tend to focus on the environment, likely because it's easiest to see changes to, or they focus on economic sustainability because they might think this trickles down and fixes social sustainability, suggesting that people will have jobs and then will be able to get themselves out of poverty, which shows the deep reach of capitalism in all of this and is an entirely other lecture, but also important to note. But I want to focus on the social aspect and or the people side of sustainability. And don't do this at home. As my grandmother says, do as I say, not as I do. I would never use Wikipedia as a source, but when I was trying to find a good definition for social sustainability, this caught my attention and I thought it was so appropriate. And it just says, social sustainability is the least defined and the least understood of the different ways of approaching sustainability and sustainable development. And I think that that is absolutely true. It is fairly difficult to find a good explanation or definition of sustainability. Instead, you often find long reports or a list of objectives to accomplish, something akin to this. But this is a good slide because it collects the UN Sustainable Development Goals in one nice list. And they actually now have really cool pictures that go along with these, which is interesting. But if we look at this list, right, where our goals are to end poverty, to end hunger, to have good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, and then partnerships to do all this, essentially everything, right? This is what the goals are, not too much to ask. That's obviously me being facetious. It's quite a lot. So where does one even begin is the question. And so here we are at part 3. How do we then move forward? I want to present a few options, some you've heard of, and then we'll talk about how a commitment to justice is also an option. Typically, when we talk about being a sustainable society, we tend to hear of 2 options: individual actions, what can we do as individuals that will lower our carbon footprint, a la No Impact Man, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, or technological advancements that will help to eliminate greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, represented here by Bill Gates and the billions he's announced he's investing in green technologies. The demographics of the people that I have illustrated here is not lost on me. For anyone not familiar with No Impact Man, Colin Beavan set out to live with as little carbon footprint as possible for a year, and he documented it in a book. He wanted to be net zero when it came to carbon, and it became sort of a joke in different articles that he was actually trying to go a year without toilet paper. He did do some very creative things to try to avoid waste, electricity use, transportation, excess water, consumption, etc. However, he ultimately found that it was virtually impossible to have no carbon footprint, right? To have actually no impact. And so he also had a category of sort of giving back so that he could have no net impact. Similarly, I would attempt this project in my own life for just a week out of the year, and I would force my class to participate along with me. And we would find that there were so many obstacles. As soon as I started to excel in one category, I would begin to falter in another. For instance, trying to have no waste meant that I might need to go to various stores that were not within walking distance to avoid individual packaging. But this then meant I would need to drive, which I had already committed to not doing. And there was no public transportation in my town, whereas Colin had the benefit of the New York City transportation grid. So I would often find myself in a predicament. Which should I pursue? No plastic packaging or no driving? And then you start to drive yourself a little bit crazy. And ultimately, I had to decide that I'm going to do the best I can where I am. The other solution, the technical solution, is often discussed as well. And Bill Gates recently gave a talk on 60 Minutes just the other week about his investment of billions into technologies like carbon capture solutions, innovations in nuclear technology, and plant-based food production. Both Bill Gates and Colin Beavan offer solutions, but are we going to be able to get everyone to live with no net impact in the time we need to affect the climate crisis? Are we going to be able to not only invent, but make and install the technology we need on the level we need to not only prevent further catastrophe, but undo the damage that has been done? It's unlikely. Sometimes we hear of a third option, and this one has really grown, I think, recently in the past decade. The activism in the environmental field has definitely evolved, as I said, over the past decade. We see more young people, we see more people of color involved, and we see an agenda that includes issues like poverty, jobs, and worker rights. In fact, just today, I just added this slide because it just happened today. I was able to hear Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, scientist, author, podcast host on climate change and climate feminism. And then, as I said today too, we can watch the swearing or the approval of to the appointment of the cabinet of Deb Harlan. So all of this to say, I really credit the role of social media and technologies that have allowed us to come together virtually, especially during the pandemic, to collectively act on these issues. This has allowed us to open the agenda and move away from narrow interest, and has allowed for inclusivity in the fight against climate change and social media, which is often seen as a democratizing platform that allows anyone with internet access to get involved. So I think we find ourselves in a really exciting time when it comes to environmental and climate justice activism. But there may be some of us that think that activism just isn't my thing. And that's okay, because I have a way that every single one of us can get involved in social sustainability. One of the things that I found interesting about Bill Gates' interview was his opening statement. He said, "We will need to see global cooperation on a scale we've never seen before." And then he spent the rest of the interview talking about technological advances that will help to make up for his very large environmental footprint. I say this sort of in jest, but if you watch the whole video, not entirely. What I found interesting was that he mentioned global cooperation and then didn't really discuss it. And this is the solution that I think that we really need to focus on. What does this look like? How do we get global cooperation? And so I start to think to myself, all right, like, could we map this out? Can we have global cooperation if we don't first have national cooperation? Can we have national cooperation if we don't have state cooperation or city cooperation or even neighborhood cooperation? It stands to reason we can't cooperate on a higher level if we don't first cooperate on a lower level to find common ground, needs, and wants. In other words, global cooperation will actually require community building at a very local level. And this will actually require us to empathize with others, because we will have to work with others that are not like us, that don't look like us, that don't share our same experiences. At its very core then, the work to be more sustainable is anti-classist work, it's anti-sexist work, it's anti-racist work. It is critical studies work, it is the work of the humanities, in addition to the work of social sciences and the natural sciences. And this means it is work that we can all have a hand in. People will likely push back at this. I've often heard in the circles that I belong to in environmental groups say that we can't do it all. But here is a quote that reminds us that racial justice is a necessary component to sustainability. The environmental movement was born of a colonial narrative that nature was out there to be explored and to be used, said Michelle Martinez, a Detroit organizer and acting executive director of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. I've had people at mainstream environmental organizations tell me point blank, if we start doing this racial justice stuff, we're going to lose some of our funders. And that risk is real. It's this idea that focusing on racial justice, it becomes less about the environment. And that's simply not true. That's that colonial mindset. I think the biggest lesson that I have learned and that I want to impart is that in my quest to find justice and sustainability, I have to be open to the fact that I do not know or have the perfect solution. And that it's more important for me to listen and to learn than to continue to lecture and pass judgment. I realize it's ironic because I'm lecturing now. However, I feel that building community and seeking justice are win-win solutions. We've read enough to understand that addressing the climate crisis is going to require all hands on deck. And so I just want to remind us that we do not have to be activists or scientists to move the needle forward on sustainability. Justice is sustainability. And if you are working towards justice, if you care about your fellow humans, you are moving the needle forward. And if you are working on sustainability, remember that in order for the work to be truly sustainable, it must be just. Keep this at the forefront of your work and you will not have to work alone. You will inherently work on the agendas of others as you work on your own, and you will help build communities that will be part of the global movement that combats the greatest crisis of our day. Thank you.
Fabulous, fabulous. And now you get to see my background and where I live. Earlier, I was trying to be fancy with the virtual background and campus, but now you can really see the office at home.
It's very bright and festive. I like it.
Wonderful. So Olivia, I have just so many questions, and I loved your lecture. Thank you so much for doing this. And I was hoping that we could just spend maybe 10 minutes just having a dialogue between the two of us. And I'm hoping that students will have questions as well as they see this and submit questions to 201H with their faculty in the seminar. But also I'm hoping that we'll have a little link that students can also send some questions that maybe you might be willing to respond to as well.
Sure.
And so I think the first thing I wanted to ask, and you mentioned this a little bit at the very beginning of your lecture, is that what inspired you to sort of begin the work that you are doing with regards to this interest in the environment and sustainability and the ways in which communities that have oftentimes been like I was going to say let go, but actually not even included from the beginning sometimes in these conversations. And so out of all the things that you could study, out of all the things that you can look at and you can sort of think about and spend a career really examining, what is it that inspired you specifically about looking at these particular issues?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I think, probably, as an academic, I think you start to realize that there's something like personal about the field that we are drawn to. There's something that brings us to that field in some way. And it's just sort of always interesting to see what's that connection and what's that tie. And for me, it really was a couple of things, right? But that as I work on my current project, I'm really starting to see these connections. But I had to pick this major, as I said, and being a first generation college student, my family only thought that you went to college if you were going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I've talked about this in other places. And I was not interested in being a doctor. I knew I didn't want to do that. So I was like, all right, I guess I'm going to college to be a lawyer. I mean, I had no idea. And
you became a doctor, but not a medical doctor.
Well, there you go. Right. I'm sorry. Yes, not a medical doctor. So, I mean, I had no idea what it meant to be a professor or how to even go about that. Like that wasn't even in my worldview at that time. So I went and I became a poli-sci major, and then probably my sophomore year realized that was not what I was going to do. And I happened to be at a land-grant college at Texas A&M, and they had a huge agriculture program and they had a horticulture program. And I had really loved, I worked at a nursery, like a plant nursery the summer before, and I loved it. And it just reminded me of spending time with my grandmothers outside in their gardens. And I really loved that. And I thought, oh, it might be cool to actually like have a major that I enjoy, like imagine that. And I think my family thought I was crazy, but I decided to be a horticulture major. And then the other thing that happened was that when I became a major, I all of a sudden had to take a bunch of science courses. In fact, that was going to be the one thing that was going to dissuade me from being the major, because in my head, I had told myself, like, I'm not a science person. We say that, right? Like, who's this? I'm a science person. I'm not a science person. And it's such a bad thing that we do to ourselves. But I had told myself this because of my experience in the sciences in high school. And, I sort of had teachers that made me think I wasn't really a science person, but also, yeah, it just wasn't, it wasn't that interesting. And I wasn't great. So I had to take all of these sciences all of a sudden, and I took them, and I was good. I was good in my science classes. I did well. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, genetics is cool. And, organic chemistry is cool. Like I understood organic chemistry, and that was such a revelation for me because I just did not ever see myself in that role. And so then I started to have these like serious questions about why did I not think I was a science person, and why did I not, why was I afraid of being in the sciences? And so that's what really got me interested into this question of who's in this field and why are people in this field. And I really started looking at this from the wrong perspective, because, and I mentioned that in my talk too, I was looking at this from the perspective of why aren't either students of color or BIPOC communities or even women interested in these fields? And that was really not the right question. The question really was, why have these fields excluded these people from these fields? Like, why have these people been excluded from the fields? That was actually the question that I think really helped me to get into the work that I'm in now. But I had the wrong question, because that's sort of what, and this is why the canon was so important. That's sort of what I had been seeing in the literature, right? Is that like, oh, these people aren't in the field, might be because they're just not interested. And that was the easy answer. But then you had to really ask the critical questions and really get at, well, why would people not be interested? Like and this is what now sort of my book project is looking. It's almost innate, like our people's connection to the land is almost innate. And so, at some point that was almost taken from us. And so how do we now sort of reconcile that, and how do we deal with that in the field too? So those are the big things that I'm drawn to, and the questions that I find really interesting.
Fascinating. I mean, I love the connections to like both family and history, and also the ways in which we start reinterpreting and reimagining actually our own possibilities and our own interest in these spaces that historically maybe we also get those messages that sort of say, oh, do you really fit, into this field or into the space, when we really do. But it's sort of giving us ourselves and also other people sort of a willingness to sort of open up that space, as well. And so the other thing I was going to ask was, in terms of sort of reconnecting then communities, what do you see as the ways in which communities are reclaiming and sort of participating? And I know we've had already a very long history already, like, and I would say 20 years of like urban gardens and the ways in which communities have been also reclaiming sort of farm space and trying to do that here in Holyoke, Massachusetts. We have, Nuestras Raíces and various different groups that have been doing that kind of work. But I was wondering, how else have you seen in your own work, and especially maybe in the book that you're writing, of communities really sort of inserting themselves and also making those kinds of interventions that is sort of reimagining now how we think about these issues of the environment, sustainability, and activism and racial justice, in these different components, but also how it's speaking to the bigger issues that you mentioned, like the UN sustainable sort of goals, that it's not just about in the environment or sustainability in very narrowly defined ways, but that it's really including all these other issues. So, I don't know if you have any examples of or work that or communities that you've been involved in the work that they've done.
Yeah, I mean, so most of my work is in the past, before I started this book project, was dealing with youth and youth groups. All I would say, but then I want to get into the community, like the maybe more adult community part, because I think that that's what's really interesting right now and how they're coming together. But I would say about the youth work that I did, what I really found to be so important to that work was, again, addressing the needs the needs of those youth. And so I would just put that to then what are the needs of the communities, right? Because the environmental organizations that I looked at that I felt were successful were ones that understood that the youth that they were working with didn't always have a quiet place to do their homework, or they didn't always have, they didn't have transportation. So this youth group would offer transportation to help the students get to, the place to do the environmental. They would test water. So they would, come to the creeks and they would test the water. The van would pick them up after school, and then it would drop them off at their homes. It would take them to their homes after school, so the parents didn't have to worry about driving the students. And it also gave them they had this hangout club where they could do their homework. It was a quiet space, so they didn't have to worry about, siblings bothering them. And then it also fed them. It made sandwiches. It had sandwiches for the youth. And sometimes that was the food for those youth that were involved in the organization. And so just really meeting the needs of those students was critical. And so that's what I would say about any type of work that we do in the communities. If we're not meeting the community's needs, how do we expect them to be involved, on a consistent basis? I mean, maybe they can be involved when they don't have to worry about making sure their water bill's paid or whatever, but how do we expect them to be involved on a consistent basis if they have these needs that aren't being met? So I think that that's really important to community building. But the other thing that I want to sort of talk about is how fascinating it's been to see the role of social media bring people together who would have never found each other before. And so that's what I'm seeing in my work now. I work with a group, Latino Outdoors, and to see them, I do collect oral histories from them, and so much of them, the stories are, I sort of thought I was the only one, but then I was looking through Twitter and I saw this hashtag. There's this great quote from somebody who was like, I saw a hashtag, what was it? It was something like cultura, but outdoors and cultura together, right? And it wasn't, he said, and it wasn't culture, it was cultura, And so being able to find each other through either organizations or through hashtags or whatever, and finding people that have identities and or interests that are similar to yours, and then being able to deepen those identities and deepen those interests has been really fascinating to see on social media. And I actually think that is the reason, I think, and I am still doing sort of some of the studies here, but I think that's the reason that's allowed the voices of people of color to be stronger and more visible today in the fight for climate justice, because we are finding that we are not the only ones, that there are other people that have these concerns and that care about these things. And so we can create collectives now a lot easier on social media platforms and come together and work towards some, the issues that we care about. So I think that's just been such a fascinating piece for me, to see how that has really pushed the agenda, the climate justice agenda forward in a way that the field, as I was talking about the field, the environmental education field and these environmental movements and, the Big 10 have been slow to move on.
So, I mean, I think you're pointing to something that I think a lot of folks are really connecting to, in the sense that social media has allowed for these both building communities. Of course, it's also been, there's been challenges to it too, of course, given the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and so on and so forth, of course. But you're absolutely right that at the same time, it has been used in a way to bring people together that perhaps were not connected before. And even, sort of at a global level as well, not just even locally or nationally, that I think becomes important. And so the last thing I want to ask you is that you started pointing to some everyday practices that people can do, to sort of start thinking about, because I think that, what I find is that sometimes folks feel like, okay, if we're going to do change, it's got to be big, it's got to be national or global, and we're not, and therefore that's too much pressure, and then I won't do anything. It's just too much. I can't even deal, because it's well, then where do we even begin?
That's right.
And I really do believe so strongly, which I feel like you're in that vein as well, that the local matters, and it matters in very, very deep ways, that you don't have to necessarily be doing the change that, I mean, ideally, of course, if you happen to be involved with the UN, awesome, at some point in your career, right? Wonderful. But if that's sort of the place where we begin, then where do we begin? And so it becomes too hard. So at the local level, I think that that is so, so key. And I was just wondering if you can talk just a few more minutes about like, how do you sort of get your students to sort of think about it in those terms, in terms of the ways in which we can do things in our everyday lives and in the everyday communities that we're part of. And even small gestures make a big difference. It doesn't have to be, sort of the big sort of, of course, big revolutions are always oftentimes do change the world in many significant ways, but not all of us can participate
That's right.
in those particular, sort of movements or spaces and so forth. So how do you talk to your students about what is possible, and not just the limitations, but really the possibilities, as we move forward? Because I think this is the issue of our, like, for the next, like, I think not just like our generation in the next 20 years, but I think for a very long time, we're going to be grappling with these issues. Um,
Yeah.
but we got to start somewhere.
Right. And I feel like, I worry because I feel like people are going to make fun of me for this very simple answer, but I think we're either engaging people or we're not, right? So that's how I'm thinking of it. Either we're engaging people or we're not. And how can we engage everybody? Like, we have to engage everybody. We literally have to engage everybody for this issue. And the simplest way that we can do that, and the way that I think everybody can be involved beyond like individually, I'm, turning off my lights or whatever, is, can you be a good neighbor? Can you be a good, roommate, right? Can you be a good colleague? How are you building? I have it, you can't see it, but on my whiteboard, it says, how are you building community today?
I love it.
Because if we can't be a community here on our campus, on our small campus, I don't know how we succeed. I don't know how we succeed in climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And so we each have a role to play to figure out, how do we build community? How do we be a better community member, a better, college peer, a better colleague? And it really is going to require us to work across difference and to have empathy and to respect each other, as much as sometimes we find it hard to do, especially today in today's polarized world. But we will not achieve what we need to achieve if we don't have a massive scale of people on board. And I think that means we have to learn to, it sounds so simple, but we have to learn to work with each other, and that means we have to build community. And so I think even sometimes when we think of like building community, that means I need to go out into, X community and help them and work with them. Like, no, you need to know your neighbors, and you need to know like what is happening in your city, how are policies decisions made in your city? Are people coming together just in your very like local group? What's happening on your campus? And so one of the things that we're going to try to do here is to sort of have a community commitment where we are coming together and really talking about what it is that we're doing, not just at the college level, but also individually, and what commitments are we willing to make to really sort of move things forward. So yeah, it's just about being a better community member. And I feel silly, and probably people will make fun of me and be like, oh yeah, just be a better community member and we're going to be sustainable. But that step literally has to happen for us to be sustainable.
I absolutely agree with you so much. And I feel like I really also talk a lot about community, and people are like, what community are you talking about? What does that mean? So forth. And I think part of it is also, stepping out of that comfort zone that sometimes people want to stay, in the smaller sort of environment. But at the same time, like you said, if we don't begin there, then it becomes really harder to really tackle the bigger sort of challenges that we are going to be tackling collectively, which we have to in order to be able to solve these issues as well, particularly those having to do with climate justice and environmental, racism that has impacted so many communities, and how we actually address it in order for it to be just. That really impacts everybody. So not just communities of color or marginalized communities and so forth. So Olivia, thank you so much. I so appreciate you being here. I forgot to introduce myself, everyone, earlier. So I'm Mari Castañeda, Dean of Commonwealth Honors College, Professor in Department of Communications. So, and of course, Dr. Olivia Aguilar, thank you so much. And I will talk to you really soon. We'll keep talking and engaging. Yes. And I just so appreciate you being the 2021, Daffodil lecture speaker. It's fabulous. And I'm hoping that students would enjoy it as well. So I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, this was so much fun.
I'm going to just stop recording.
Okay.
Okay. Bye, everyone.